Okay, now for the program and the reason you're all here. We have a presentation tonight that's known as a Chautauqua. Chautauquans are scholars who portray historical characters. Tonight we have John Muir, who will represent an environmental perspective in the West and will help bring to life the ideas that began during the past century in response to the wide-scale destruction of public lands by some of the early pioneers. The character of John Muir will make a 40-minute presentation and will then take questions from the audience as the character, and then take questions as a scholar on John Muir. John Muir has been referred to as a naturalist, an explorer, inventor, and philosopher. A Scottish immigrant, John spent much of his adult life exploring and studying the Sierras and Alaska. The author of more than 24 books, John gained respect as the nation's foremost spokesperson for wilderness and the ideas of preservation and reverence for life. He promoted the designation of Yosemite, Grand Canyon, and Petrified Forest National Parks, and was one of the founders and first president of the Sierra Club in 1892. Okay, and so we are ready for John Muir.
Greetings, friends and fellow lovers for nature. It is truly an honor to come here tonight, for I understand that you are members of the Audubon Society, and I do appreciate that you like birds. I did, however, have a little bit of difference with the man that you named your organization for I understand he shot every bird that he painted, but we can talk about that later. I also feel that it is important for you to understand that there's more to the natural world than birds. Trees, for example. Birds need trees. And so I think we can have some common ground, and I appreciate your attention as I share with you some of the stories about nature and why I consider God's creation to be one of our greatest gifts that we need to protect. I've just come from a glorious saunter in the forest not far from here when I happened to come across one of God's greatest creatures, a mountain lion. How many of you have seen a mountain lion? Oh, there are several. We'll have to share stories afterwards. Well, for me, it was the chance of a lifetime. I was out wandering on a place called Mingus Mountain in the fresh snowfall. And there I came across the tracks of a mountain lion. And I knelt down, for there was a stream that was wandering through the forest. And I knelt down to get a little sip of water. And then I looked up. And there he stood, not 60 feet away. And he had his paw up, and he was looking right at me. And I said, "Hello, Mr. Mountain Lion." Well, I think he was rather unnerved, but he went over and climbed up into this ponderosa. And I went over to the tree, and I gazed up into the branches. I could see his eyes. Do you know what color a mountain lion's eyes are? Yes, these were emerald green, though I've heard some are yellow. Well, there he stared at me, and I stared at him. And then I thought to myself, this is a very foolish place for me to be standing. So I moved over to another ponderosa that was about 30 feet away, and there we gazed at each other and into each other's eyes and perhaps into his soul. He was looking at me and panting, his pink tongue coming in and out, and his whiskers vibrating. We gazed at each other for a good half hour. And then, I think he grew rather bored with me. For he stood up on the branch, stretched and yawned, and then went over to the trunk. And from 25 feet off the ground, he leapt, hitting the trunk once and landing like a whisper and disappearing into the forest. Oh, I sat in the tree for a good while, thanking God for this glorious experience. I would hope that all of you have a chance to see and have an encounter with a mountain lion. I don't think you have to worry about them so. They do not want to eat us unless they are very, very hungry. And I understand you have a lot of javelin around here now, so that should serve them well. Well, I descended the tree and began walking through the forest. And then I came across a road that was winding through the trees. And as I came around the bend, I could see that there were trees that had been cut down all along the road on either side. And in the distance, I could hear the cutting of another tree. And I went up to the men who were dressed in uniforms, and I said, "What are you doing to my trees?" Well, they looked at me as if I was rather strange. And I said, "What are you doing to the trees?" And they said, "We've been given orders to cut down these trees to daylight the road." "What is daylighting the road?" I asked. "Well, we've been given directions to cut down these trees to daylight the road so that after a rain the road will dry out faster." And then they went on their way. Well, I knelt down and I began counting the rings, for every year represents another year's growth. And this alligator juniper was 1,200 years old. 1,200 years old, and these men representing our government had cut down these trees to daylight the road? Why, that is about as ridiculous as when they cut down one of my giant sequoias to make a dance floor for 50 people. Or another, they skinned it to a height of 150 feet to send it off to show the monarchs of Europe the mighty strength of our government. Rather, our forests. Perhaps we should send our politicians abroad and skin them to show the strength of our government. But I did not come here to share with you these tragic things I've seen, but rather to share with you some of the really wonderful things and experiences I've had in nature. One of the most glorious storms I ever experienced was in December of 1874, when I happened to be exploring a tributary of the Yuba River in California. When the storm began to sound, I lost no time in getting out into it, for on such occasions, nature has often something rare to show us. And the danger to life and limb is hardly greater than one would experience crouching deprecatingly beneath a roof. I made my way out in the forest. Sunshine came pouring over the hills, setting free a stream of summery fragrance. I could hear trees crashing at the rate of one every 2 or 3 minutes, some on account of the loose water-soaked condition of the ground, while others broke straight across where a previous forest fire had weakened the trunk. And leaning up against one of the matriarchs, I could feel the vibrations clear down to the roots. Oh, nature was holding a high festival, and every fiber of the forest was thrilled with glad excitement. Toward midday, I made my way to the highest ridge in the neighborhood. And then it occurred to me, it would be a fine thing to climb one of these trees and get my ear close to the aeolian music of the topmost branches. But under the circumstances, the choice of a tree was a rather serious matter. One whose instep was weak was in danger of falling, or of being caught by another in case it should fall. But after cautiously casting about, I made the choice of the tallest of a group of Douglas fir that were growing together like a clump of grass, no one of which was likely to fall unless they all fell together. Well, being used to studying plants and getting myself up in trees, I experienced no difficulty in climbing this Douglas fir, And soon I found myself 100 feet off the ground. The treetop was swinging backwards and forwards in indescribable arcs, while I hung, firm-braced, like a bobolink on a reed. Well, after a good 45 minutes, the storm began to die away, and I sat there mesmerized with what I had seen and experienced. We hear much nowadays about the ideas of Darwin and the struggle for existence, but there was no struggle here, no deprecation, rather a remote gladness, as remote from exultation as from fear. And turning toward the east, I beheld the countless hosts of the forest, hushed and tranquil. The summer setting light filled with amber and seemed to say as they listened, "My peace I give unto you." And never before did a forest seem so tranquil, so peaceful, so primordial. I think I've always loved being out in nature, even as a barn growing up in Scotland. For you see, in those days, nature was a place for me to escape from the drudgeries of school, where at school they made us memorize our lessons. Now, do they make you memorize your lessons today? They do? And do they beat you if you do not have your lessons memorized? They don't. Well, that's very good. You see, in Scotland in those days, they believed there was a clear connection between the retention of the mind and the excitement of the flesh. And at home it was much the same. For you see, my father was a devout Calvinist and believed that we should memorize the Bible. So by the age of 11, I had the entire New Testament and 2/3 of the Old Testament memorized by heart. And Father beat me daily, saying, "John, I know you've likely sinned today." Well, I was a boy growing up in Scotland, and we would climb on the ruins of the Dunbar Castle and fend off the English. And we'd get into some scuffles, and I'd come home with a bloody nose, and my father would say, "John, you've been up to no good today." And there he would give me a good thrashing. But one day I came home from school, and my father said, "John, you do not have to memorize the lessons today. Pack your things, for tomorrow I'm taking you, your older brother and sister, and we are going to America." America. I had read about America, where it was said that a squirrel could jump from tree limb to tree limb, from the Atlantic all the way to a mighty river called the Mississippi, without ever touching the ground. And that maple trees grew out of gold, and their sap flowed with sugar. And we were going to a wilderness called Wisconsin. Now, are any of you from Wisconsin? You are? Where are you from? Eau Claire. Well, we found our farm not far from Portage. Do you know where that is? You do? Well, have you been back there recently? Well, I'd like to talk later. And we arrived at a place called Milwaukee. Now, have you been there? You have. Now, it wasn't much of a place when I was there. The streets were very muddy, and there were all these wooden buildings, and it was rather a frontier town, I would say, at the very least. They did not have the kind of stone buildings that we had in Scotland. Does it still look that way today? No. Well, I'm very curious to talk to you later. For me, it was so exciting to come to this place, realizing it was on the edge of the frontier. Well, my father purchased a wagon. We put our belongings in the wagon, but there was no place for my brother, sister, or I, so we had to walk behind for 2 weeks out into the wilderness. We arrived at a farm that my father had purchased, and all I wanted to do was to go out and explore and discover all the animals and plants and flowers. But there was very little time, for you see, my father had us up at 4:30 in the morning. We had to eat our breakfast, and then we began our work, cutting down the trees, pulling out stumps, tilling the field, and planting crops, and building a cabin so that 3 months later my mother and younger brothers and sisters could have a warm house to arrive in for those very cold Wisconsin winters. Well, after 7 years, the ground gave out. We were wheat farmers, you see, and we did not understand that wheat farming in the Midwest was a very easy way to deplete the soils. And so we moved to a second farm. We called it Hickory Hill. The soil was better, but there was no living water, no spring or seep. And so a well 90 feet deep had to be dug, and all but the first 10 feet through fine-grained sandstone. And Father said, "John, you shall do the work." So with the mason's chisel and hammer, I knelt in a space 3 feet in diameter and wearily chipped for weeks and months. Father lowered me in a bucket attached to a windlass. There I would gather the chips from the night before, and then I would be left there until lunch, when I'd be brought out and fed and then lowered again into the darkness. One day, when the dreary bore was about 80 feet deep, I nearly died of deadly choke damp, carbonic acid gas that had gathered in the well during the night. Father lowered me as usual, but when he did not hear me gathering the chips, he called down, "John, what's keeping you so still?" To which he got no reply. But just as I was about to go unconscious, I happened to glance up and see the branch of a burdock tree. And to Father's calling, I feebly responded, "Take me out." But when he began to raise the bucket, he found I was not in it. And so he called down, "John, get in the bucket, get in and hold on, hold on." Somehow I managed to get an arm and a leg in the bucket. And that is all I remember, till I was brought out, violently gasping for air. But I do remember this. The horror was that the deeper I was immersed in the invisible poison, the less capable I was to take willing measures to escape from it. And so I find the vast majority of humanity so immersed in your silly jobs of town building and job getting and studying the spirits in heaven that you cannot see the heaven that God has created all around us in nature. And so I want to yell to you, get in the bucket, get in and hold on, for unless you're able to rouse ourselves, our forests and our national parks will be plundered from every degree, from presidents to senators, from city supervisors to dam builders, all justifying their greed and plundering as the utilization of natural resources. But I wasn't to learn these lessons yet, for I was still a teenager growing up in Wisconsin. And all I wanted to was have a little time for myself. And so one morning I asked my father, if I get up earlier, can I have some time for myself? He said yes. The next morning I awoke at 1 o'clock. I had 3.5 hours for myself, and so I crept down into the cellar and I lit a candle. And there I began reading books that I had gotten from the neighbors, who were friends of my father. But you see, my father did not want any other book besides the Bible in the house. But I brought in books on history and literature and botany and geology. And I also began making inventions. Well, I made a thermometer that we attached to the barn door that could measure the change of temperature when a man walked within 3 feet of it. And another was a clock attached to a scythe that we put up in the burdock tree so that we could see the time of day and when our work was to be done. But I think my favorite machine, well, I called it my early rising machine. And this was a clock that was attached to weights that was attached to my bed. And at the given hour, it would lift up the bed, deposit me on the ground, push out a book, light a candle, and begin turning pages in 1-minute intervals. After 15 minutes, it would close the book and push out another. Now that, I figured, was good Scottish efficiency. But my father thought it was a terrible waste of time and said, "You should read the Bible." Well, I had the Bible nearly memorized. But a neighbor came by, and he was a friend of my father, so he had some influence. And he said, John Muir, these inventions are really quite remarkable. Have you thought about taking them to the state fair? Well, I was 22 years old, and I had not left home. And so my father even gave permission for my brother to take me to the train station in Portage. And there I unloaded my inventions. And the conductor came up and said, well, what do we have here, young man? And I said, well, I'm an inventor, and I'm going to the state fair in Madison, Wisconsin. An inventor, he said. Well, perhaps you'd like to meet the engineer. I had never been on a train before. And so he escorted me to the front of the train. And there he introduced me to the engineer as the young inventor, John Muir. And the engineer said, well, young man, would you like to come and sit next to me in the engine? We began moving. Have you ever been on a train? We went flying across the landscape. And he showed me all these gadgets and dials and things that he pulled and made the train just fly. And then he said, John, you look like you're a very fit man. Have you ever gone out and stood on the cow catcher? He said, you just be careful now, but hang on and go up there. We're going slow enough. And when you get up there, hang on. Well, I made my way to the front of the train and stood on the cow catcher. I highly recommend you try this. It was amazing. I didn't even have to flap my wings and fly. It was truly remarkable. Well, it took us several hours to get to Madison, but when we arrived, I got my inventions and I went to the knoll in the fairgrounds, and there I set up my booth. And I saw these two boys that were about your age. And I said, would you mind laying down in this bed? Well, soon I had them being deposited on the ground in 15-minute intervals. And my booth became one of the main attractions at the fair and was even written up in the newspaper. Have you seen the great, wondrous inventions by the young Scottish immigrant, John Muir? But what was really remarkable was that one of the boys was the son of Dr. Carr, professor of geology at the University of Wisconsin. And I was invited to his house, where I was escorted in, and we sat in a parlor while his wife, Jean, served us tea in china cups. And we talked for a good hour. And he said, you seem like a very intelligent young man. Have you thought about attending the university? Oh, I said, I've only had 6 years of education in Scotland, and we were too far away from the school in outside of Portage, where I would walk for 7 miles, and occasionally we made our way there. But I only had about 6 months of a 3-year time that we were there, and then we moved again. And he said, yes, we'll give you some tests and see how you do. Well, I took these tests. I thought they were very easy, and I got a letter from the professor saying that I had been accepted as a student at the University of Wisconsin, where I was able to study subjects in chemistry and geography and geology and botany, and all those subjects that my father had said I shouldn't waste my time on. Well, my intent was to transfer to the University of Michigan and study medicine, but the Civil War broke out. Now, I must explain that we were pacifists, you see. We believed that thou shalt not kill. And we did not understand this conflict. We had only been in America for a few years. And so my mother pleaded with my older brother and I to leave the United States and go to Canada. And so I left the University of Wisconsin and entered the University of the Wilderness. My brother found work at a broom factory in Ontario, Canada, on the north shore of Lake Huron, but I gave myself 3 months to explore the primordial forests of Ontario. Have any of you seen these forests that extend for hundreds of miles, of trees that are centuries years old? I do hope they're still there. It was an amazing experience to wander for days beneath the canopy. And one day, on a cold, gray November morning, I came to a great marsh. And I could see in the distance the far shore, but I could not see any easy way around it. So I plunged into the marsh. And I made my way after a good hour to a small island that came out of it. And there I encountered the Calypso borealis, the rare white orchid of the north. And I realized the universe would be incomplete without man. But it would be incomplete without the smallest transmicroscopic creature that dwells beyond our conceitful eyes and knowledge. In nature, man can see himself part of something much greater than us. And such understanding comes the respect for the rights of all the rest of creation. I joined my brother at the broom factory. We worked there for several months making brooms. We sent what we could back to my family in Wisconsin, for the economic conditions during the Civil War were very, very dire. But then on a cold December morning the next year, the broom factory caught on fire. Most of our work from that year was destroyed. By then, the Civil War had come to an end. I heard there were jobs in a place called Indianapolis, and so I made my way there, and there I found work at a carriage factory. When I began working there, I could see that the machinery was old and dilapidated, and the men were not working in any good Scottish order. So I made some suggestions. They did not like my reference to Scottish order, but they did accept some of my ideas, and I worked on the machines, and soon they were producing more carriages in 3 months than they normally produced in 6. And I was elevated to a much higher rank of responsibility, and I suppose I could have become a very successful inventor and businessman had it not been for a divine intervention. One morning when I came into the factory to work, before any of the others arrived, I was tightening up one of the belts when suddenly the file that I was using slipped and plunged into my right eye. I could feel the aqueous humor dripping into my palm, and my left eye went blind out of sympathy for the pain that I was experiencing. When the men arrived, I was curled up on the floor. The doctor was summoned, and I was taken home and examined. And he said, "John, you've experienced a very, very severe accident to your right eye. I do not know if you'll ever have a chance to see again from that eye. There is a chance, but you must remain in bed in a darkened room for 2 months." I felt as though I had been laid in a casket. And I prayed to God. I prayed if ever I had a chance to see again, I would forever forget the inventions of man and go out and worship the inventions of God in nature. And after 2 months, they raised the blinds, and I saw the light of day out of both of my eyes, and I looked out, and I saw a robin on a branch. And I wept. For God had given me a second chance. And I kept my promise. And I began a 1,000-mile walk through the South 2 years after the Civil War. The amount of human suffering that I came across was beyond anything that I would like to share with you. And the desperation of an entire landscape as a result of war laid before me. But I found glades in the mountains of Appalachia that had not been touched by the war. And there, God's peace and grace still abounded. I made my way to a town called Savannah, Georgia. The people there were very poor and suffering now. They were desperate people, and the only safe place I could figure I could sleep was in the cemetery. And unfortunately, there were many mosquitoes, and I do believe it was there that I was bitten by one that carried the malaria. For by the time I reached Florida, I was deathly ill. My intent had been to go to South America, for I had read the works of Alexander von Humboldt, and I wanted, so to go to South America and explore the Amazon to its very source. But the doctor scoffed and said, "That would be very foolish, John Muir. You have malaria. You have a chance of recovery, but you must go to a climate that is more conducive." And he suggested California. Well, I had read about California, and I thought to myself, I have put aside enough money in my shoe to buy passage on a great white sailing ship. And I made my way to New York and jumped on a ship and went to the Panama, where I crossed the isthmus and then caught another boat. And 2 months later, I arrived in San Francisco, where I jumped off the boat and I called out, "What is the fastest way to the wilderness?" Oh, people looked at me as I was so strange. But there was one young man from the boat who said, "I'll go with you, Johnny Muir." And so the two of us set out across the Central Valley of California in the springtime. Have any of you seen the Central Valley of California? It was a carpet of flowers for 500 miles from north to south. And there, in the distance, the Sierra, the range of light, still covered in snow. And it was there at a place called Yosemite that I made my home. And I built a little cabin out over one of the streams, and there I had a trapdoor that I could get fresh water right out of the stream. Fresh, cold water that came from hidden glaciers high in the mountains. Well, I found work at a mill that was cutting wood that had blown down in a great storm. And I was also given the responsibility of tending sheep. Now, I can tell you from being a Scotsman that I know how to tend sheep. But here, there were flocks of them, and I went off for months at a time to follow these flocks of sheep. Well, by then, Mrs. Carr, who was the wife of Professor Carr and had introduced me to the transcendental writers, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and how I realized that there were other people that now believed as I did, that if we went to nature, we are going to God's creation that has not been tainted by man. And she sent me a journal, for they were now living in Berkeley, where he had received a new professorship. And she said, "John, please write your stories down." And so I began journaling my stories of the water ouzel. All of you must know of the water ouzel, the dipper. One of the most beautiful birds that God has created, and quite remarkable that they can run underwater and make their nests behind a waterfall. And their song, have you heard their song? It is really one of the most beautiful of all songs. And I wrote an essay about the bear and the trees of the Sierras, the redwoods, the sequoias, the sugar pines that have cones this big, the Doug fir. Well, I spent 4 years at Yosemite, and then I realized that I needed to go on and do some other work. And so I left Yosemite with the intent of coming back. But before I left, I had written an essay. And I have to step back a minute, because this all happened very quickly after I sent Mrs. Carr an essay that I'd written about the cataclysmic events that Dr. Whitney described as being how Yosemite Valley was formed. And I thought to myself, this is very strange, for I've been there during an earthquake, and he said, professed no less, that Yosemite Valley had dropped 5,000 feet. Well, I was there during a great earthquake, and I can tell you it did not drop even an inch, though big rocks fell from the mountainsides, including the Eagle Rock. But I had noticed that in the rock were scrapings and gouges. And I described these in my journal and speculated that could it be that at one time the remnant glaciers that I had found up while tending sheep could have been much larger and could have actually carved Yosemite Valley with a great glacier. Well, a month later I received a letter from Dr. Whitney. And he said, "Who is this John Muir? What does he know about geology or anything for that matter?" Oh, I was so embarrassed. Mrs. Carr. But 2 months later, I received a letter from Dr. Agassiz, the great alpine geologist of Switzerland. And he wrote to me and said, "To the geologist John Muir, I do believe you've come across concrete evidence of glaciation, and I am sending my colleagues of geology to come visit you in Yosemite. Please attend to their needs." Mrs. Carr, this is really getting out of hand. But unbeknownst to me, she also submitted some of my essays about the water ouzel and the bear. And they were published in a national magazine called Centennial Magazine. And soon there were people coming to Yosemite saying, "We would like to meet the naturalist writer, John Muir." But one of the most amazing days of my 4 years at Yosemite was when Ralph Waldo Emerson himself came to see Yosemite. And when he arrived, he asked to meet the young transcendental writer, John Muir, the tramp. My father even ripped up my articles so that he read them and said, "John, you are wasting your time. You are best to read the Bible and not waste time and others in reading these pieces of simple dirt." And here, Ralph Waldo Emerson came up and shook my hand and said, "You are a remarkable writer, John Muir. Would you consider coming back to a place called Concord, Massachusetts, and staying with me and studying the ideas of transcendentalism?" And I said, "Oh, I cannot leave my home, my animals, my trees. This is where I belong." And I asked, "Would you not like to come out and sleep among the great trees?" And the men intervened and said, "John, that's a very rude thing to say to Mr. Emerson, for he is a very distinguished man. He needs to stay in the hotel." "Well, the hotel is full of mold and old, moist, and..." I did not say that. But I wanted to. And after 5 days, they left. And as he got up on his great white horse, and they started riding across the meadow, he turned back and he said, "John, remember this. The wonder is that we can see these trees and not wonder more." And so I find it. Any fool can destroy a tree. They cannot run away. And if they could, they would still be chased and hunted as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark, their hide, their spreading horn branches, their magnificent bold backbone. And few who fell trees plant them, nor would planting them avail anything like the noble forests that once graced our land. In a man's lifetime, only saplings can be grown compared to the trees centuries old that once graced our country. In a man's lifetime, only saplings will grow, but here in California, we had trees that were hundreds of years old, thousands of years old. And God has cared for these trees through drought, disease, avalanche, and 1,000 straining tempests and floods. but he cannot save them from fools. So it is only like people like you who care about nature and birds and trees that can do that. And so I thank you for listening and hope that you will continue to care. Thank you. Well, I'd be honored if you gave me a few questions, and then I must be on my way shortly. Yes.
Mr. Muir, did you ever see a forest fire?
Oh, I did. I'm so glad you asked me that. That was one of the... Have you, by any chance, read my essay about the fire that went through the sequoias? No, you have not. Well, I don't know where you can find it, but I hope they're out there. I did experience, that some of the old fires, they burned cavities into these great trees. Well, I found one that was almost like a bedroom. It was so large. And so when a fire was approaching, I thought, I'm going to put myself in that place because I think it's going to be protected because the sequoias are resistant to fire. Well, the fire came during the middle of the night. It was remarkable to look out and see trees glowing and bursting into flames. And I was warm, but I was very comfortable inside that sequoia. And it was a remarkable experience. And I see the value of fire. However, I do also believe that many of our forests are being burned with no regard. And we must question whether or not natural fires are the same as human-caused fires. For I have not felt that when I've seen some of the desperate conditions in California where the trees were burned down just to expose the ground for gold. Yes?
Did you ever meet President Roosevelt?
Oh, I did. He came to visit me. How did you know about this? Oh, you did. Well, yes, what a very distinguished, interesting man he is. And he came, he actually invited me. Well, I have to back up. He came and we went out for a camp experience, and he got away from all of his other politicians, and he said, John, I want to go out and sleep among the trees with you. That night, it snowed a good 5 inches, and he woke up in the morning and said, this is one of the bulliest mornings I've ever had. And another night, well, we crept out and we lit one of the dead old sequoias that was standing there, and it was a big bonfire we had out there in the forest. It was quite an amazing experience I had with Teddy Roosevelt. We talked until late. He talks more than I do. But I did confront him on something. He has this persuasion of going off to Africa and killing animals so he can put their heads on walls. And I said, isn't that a rather egotistical thing to do? And I think quite childish, quite frankly. I think he was quite taken aback because he was the president after all, but I had not anything to lose by saying my point of view. And I think he respected that. And he said, well, perhaps you're right, John Muir, although I read in the paper 6 months later that he was off again in Africa shooting elephants and rhinoceros. What a silly thing to do. I do not understand this idea of putting animal heads on your walls. But he did invite me to be on a team that went through the West and inventoried land for possible parks. And one of the places we went to was actually the Grand Canyon right here in Arizona. And we went to, what an amazing place that is. We went to the very rim, and there was this young upstart in the group. His name was Gifford Pinchot. Have you heard of him? Well, he was quite a likable young man, and I encouraged him to come out, and we camped right next to the rim. And I woke him up in the morning before the sun had come up, and I said, wake up, Giff. Let's stand on our heads and watch the sunrise upside down. I think he quite liked me. We got along quite well. But then I had some differences with him. For you see, he believed in this idea that the forest should be utilized for the best use for the most number of people, and that perhaps grazing should be one of the main uses of our forests. And I met Gifford at a hotel up in Seattle, and I said, Gifford Pinchot, have you not been up in the Alpine and seen the results of overgrazing? This is the place where our water comes from. And he said, we are able to make more money from grazing sheep than producing water in these places. Well, I wonder what the situation is like today. For I could see the effects of overgrazing, especially at that time in the late 1800s, where so much of the Southwest was overgrazed. Well, he was quite an impressive president, Teddy Roosevelt, and I have to thank him for so much of what he did, even though he did not agree with me, for I wanted the military to defend our forests. Instead, he decided we should have an agency called the National Forest Service, which I think is quite an important agency. I'll have to admit that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Have you had any confrontations with any Indians on your travels?
I did, and that's a very interesting thing you asked. For where I was living in Wisconsin, there were still remnants of some of the tribes that had been moved out of the area for the pioneers. And being Christian, we took pity on these people who seemed to be so desperate. And so we always gave them food, and sometimes they would come and stand beside our house, just standing there. And I would ask my parents, do they not have homes? And my father said, well, they've been moved to go someplace else. But he never explained why that was. And then when I arrived in California, I saw many Indians that were in terrible condition. Most of them by then were alcoholic. And I wondered what it would be like to have your homeland taken away. And in California, the government actually had a policy to eradicate the Native Americans, the Indians. And I did not agree with that, but I was there 30 years after most of them had been killed. And those that were left were very unfortunate people. But when I went to Alaska, I saw a very different situation. I saw Native Americans that still lived as they have for hundreds of years. I went on the Harriman expedition. I was invited along on that with a young man called Edward Curtis. Are you familiar with him? He impressed upon me that through his work as a photographer, that he had documented some of the last of the Native Americans of North America. And that in order to meet these people and have them agree to take photos, he had to learn their languages. He spent his lifetime doing that. But when he was on the Harriman expedition, we were the only two on the entire expedition that included people like many scientists, and there were ornithologists, there were biologists, there were scientists. And when we get to, Grinnell was on the trip. Do you know about Grinnell? When we get to some of these places, everybody would run for their guns and start shooting at the walruses and the seals and the animals as if they were just simply targets. And they said, oh, we're collecting these for science. Well, they killed many an animal, and I did not partake in that. Nor did I partake in them going to some of the Native American villages that had been left abandoned because of some of the rheumatic fevers and scarlet fever and that sort of thing that had come into these places. And the team of scientists said, this is an opportunity for us to take their artifacts back to the Smithsonian Institute. And so they stole them, I felt. But both Edward Curtis and I agreed that that was not a proper thing to do. And I was invited into some homes there that were very different from what you and I would consider a home, but they were very clean and very comfortable. And so I've always had respect for the native peoples. And it wasn't until I went to Alaska that I saw how they really lived in close balance with nature. But I do have one last story I would like to share from my experience in Alaska. Because I did have a very close connection with the Stickeen Indians. And I had a friend who was a Presbyterian missionary. who was working with the Stikines. And he had been given a little dog by a fur trapper, and he had named the dog Stikine. Now, Stikine was not exactly a very intelligent-looking dog. He was slight. He had a long, slender nose and a long, bushy tail and long hair. And when the wind blew in the wrong direction, he looked all disheveled. And he would never come when he was called. And we went out on this trip to explore some of the coastline in southern Alaska. And when we come to shore, he would run off and then go into the forest, and we would not see him for hours. And it was time to leave, so we got back in the boat, and we called and called, and I figured, well, I bet he's been eaten by a wolf. And then he'd come when we were about 100 feet out in the sea, and he comes swimming out to the boat, and they pulled him in right next to me, and he shook himself off all over us. Now, I've had many a dog that is quite intelligent. The sheep-herding dogs are. But this dog I did not have very much respect for. Well, that very night, we camped beneath a great glacier. And in the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of a growing storm. And I thought to myself, this is no time to be sleeping. I must be out and onto the glacier and see what nature is doing. And so as I made my way out of the tent, I began quietly getting away when suddenly I heard this pathetic little meow. And I looked, and there was his head sticking out of the tent. And I said, go back, Stikine, go back. Go back to your owner where you belong. This is no kind of weather for you to be out in. And he came up and sat right at my feet and lifted his little paw and went, meow. What could I do? So I reached into my pocket where I had some bread, and I gave him some crumbs, and I said, here is your breakfast. And so began one of the most eventful days of my life. In the morning, we made it out in the glacier, and we made a game of it. In fact, have you ever been to a glacier? You have? Have you been to a glacier? Do you know what a crevasse is? Huh? Well, we're going to pretend. Who can explain what a crevasse is? It's a big crack of ice. Yes, it's a crack in the ice, and some of them can be quite small, and some of them quite large. So if you'd be willing to come up, the three of you, could you come up? You don't have to if you don't want to. But we're going to pretend that this is a crevasse. So I want you to stand over there, and we're going to make the line right here. And so I want you to see if you can go back a little further and jump and make it to this point right here. Okay? Are you willing to go first? Would you go first? Well, if you started there, you have to jump from right here. Let's do it once more and see if you can make it over there. Oh, I think you have to go a little farther. Can you try it? We'll move it a little closer. How's that? All right. Excellent. You just about made it. I think you would have been fine. Well, okay, you can sit down now. So Stikine and I made this a game, and we got to crevasses that were 5 and 6 and 7 feet wide. And we made it across with no problem. But then we came to a crevasse that was 12 feet wide and lower on the far side. And so I took a running leap and made it with just an inch to spare. And Stikine made it as well. And then we went running on. And then we came to a crevasse that was 50 feet across. And now it was starting to really snow hard, and the wind was blowing. And I ran to the right for a good quarter of a mile, and the two crevasses came together. And then I ran back to the left, and my heart sank when I realized that those crevasses came together too, and we were isolated on an island of ice in a deepening storm. And I said, Stikine, I'm so sorry I've gotten us in this predicament. And I began searching for any way back, but I could not make it up to the other side that was 12 feet across, for it was 2 feet higher. And I knew Stikeen would not be able to do it there either. And so searching around, I found one place where a thin bridge of ice spanned the 50 feet across and dropped 25 feet down, but made it to the other side. And so I pulled out my ice axe, and I began cutting steps in the edge of the crevasse, one after another, down 25 feet. And there at the bridge itself, I put a leg on either side and shaved off the top to make a very narrow but flat surface on the bridge. And there I scooched my way across to the other side where I cut steps up to the top. But think of Stikeen. When I began cutting the steps, he came up and put his head on my shoulder, and as if in clear English, he said, "No! No!" And then he ran away. I stood there and I called him, "Stikeen, if you go back the other way, I can hear there are wolves. So you must try to come now. I am sorry I've gotten you into this situation, but if you do not come now, I have to leave, for I am going to freeze. And all I can promise is that I'll come back for you. But I have to go." And so, as if he understood every word, he came up to the edge of the ice and looked down and just "Woo!" and screamed again. But then his first two paws went down over the edge to the first step, and his back paws came over down to the first step, and then down to the next, and the next, and the next. And he made it to the bridge itself. And as if he knew that every step he took might be his last, for he could see the water rushing underneath him and disappearing in the crevasse below. And the wind was blowing, and he looked remarkable, as if he had every intention to make it across the bridge. And he did. But it was there that I feared the most, for dogs are not good climbers on vertical ice. And so I pulled out what I didn't have, a belt or anything. And I called to him and I said, "Stikeen, you must try." And I could see him studying every move he would take. And suddenly I saw this little dog come running right up the side of the crevasse, making it to every step, all the way to the top. Safe at last. And he ran by me and then came back, and from 10 feet away he jumped and hit me in the face, and we rolled and laughed and cried and laughed again. Why, Moses never experienced so much joy when God caused the seas to separate for him. And through Stikeen, as if looking through a clear pane of glass, I've come to understand we are connected to these other mortal beings, the animals that we share this world with. For in Stikeen, I saw all of the emotions that I was experiencing. The excitement of being out in nature, the joy of jumping over crevasses, the horror of realizing this might be the end of our lives, and the ultimate euphoria of salvation. And when we made camp the next night, Stikeen came over next to me and sat next to me and laid down next to me and put his head on my lap and looked at me with those big brown eyes as if to say, "Now that was quite an adventure." Thank you very much.
Okay, before you talk to John Muir as Professor Doug Hume, I'd like to read you a little background about his performances. Doug performed John Muir for several years under a contract with the Arizona Humanities Council on a Scholar Speakers Bureau. He is a professor of environmental history and philosophy, where he teaches courses also in ecology and environmental education, wilderness education. Doug was the co-recipient of the 1990 National Wilderness Education Award, sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service and the Isaac Walton League. In 1994, Doug received the Educator of the Year and President's Appreciation Awards from the Arizona Environmental Education Association. In 1997, Doug was a guest professor at Telemark College, where he taught with Norway's first interdisciplinary environmental studies program. In May of 1998, Doug received an award for Outstanding Presenter at the National Wilderness Rangers Conference in Durango, Colorado, for his performance of John Muir. In September 2004, Doug was invited to perform in Washington, D.C. for the 40th anniversary celebration of the Wilderness Act. This past June, Doug was invited to perform at the American International School in Paris, France. He is presently researching the traditions, mythology, and folklore of planting sacred trees on farms in Norway and Sweden. So I think we're very honored to have had Doug here for our program. And now you can ask him questions as Doug Humes.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to just really thank all of you. Audubon Society in Prescott has been an organization that I've known and been affiliated with for many years. And you are making a big difference in this community. You are caring about the environment in ways that needs to be done. And I know you're out there doing a lot of great work. And I'd be happy to answer just a couple questions about my performance or anything you want to know about the work that I'm doing. The question was, did I write the script? And yeah, I wrote the script, and the opportunity I had with the Arizona Humanities Council was that we were given a stipend and some training with the gentleman who did Thomas Jefferson. I'm trying to think of his name right now. It'll come to me, but he's pretty well known, and so he came and gave us some good professional. Jenkins is his name, and he's done some TV programs doing Thomas Jefferson. But we were given the instructions that we had to present in front of a scholars group in order to see how were we doing. And I had been out in the field, so I had the opportunity to not have the time, really, because of my work in the field, to really put together what I wanted to. And then I thought, well, I know John Muir had a lot of good encounters with animals, and so I used my encounter with the mountain lion as my own experience. That was my own experience, and I used it as a way of getting into character, and they never knew the difference. So in any case, it was a real honor to work for the Arizona Humanities Council, to do this for the national conference that was held here on environmental ethics in 1991, and then I was under contract for another 6 years with the Arizona Humanities Council, and since then I've been doing it on my own, and it's been really a delight of my life to be able to share the philosophies and life of John Muir, who I do believe is one of America's greatest heroes. I think his life was a bridge between spirituality, religion, and science, which I think is really needed at this time. And by his comments about the politicians exploiting our natural resources, I fear that it's as bad now as it ever was. And it's going to be a concerted effort that we don't lose our public lands. It's the platform I fear that I fear the most right now about a lot of things that are going on. But the idea that nature is only viewed as a commodity by a lot of politicians, to me, is really problematic. They don't understand the ecological importance of a lot of our lands in the West, and that we simply don't have enough water for the kind of development that is being promoted. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Your question. Yeah. No. I don't. And the reason, in the Chautauqua format, you're supposed to really recognize that this person lived at a particular time and would not be aware of the situation today. Water was not a top priority, although it certainly was understood by John Wesley Powell and some of the other people that were contemporaries of John Muir, but I honestly never found that he wrote anything himself about the water issues in the West. I do recognize that that was being discussed, and certainly John Wesley Powell was one of the main people who really argued that we can't have the same kind of Jeffersonian utopian ideal that was going on in the East as far as people having 120 acres or a section of land, 360 acres in order to raise a family and live sustainably. Great idea. That's not going to work in many places in the West. And John Wesley Powell certainly understood that. John Muir never mentioned it in any of the works that I've read about him. Right. Excellent question. And I teach a course at Prescott College on park and wilderness management, and I also was a seasonal ranger in Canyonlands. So I think John Muir definitely recognized that land needed to be protected. His solution was to use the military, which I think would have been really interesting to see what that would have created. But the problem was a lot of land was just being, the forests were not being managed at the time until the Forest Service really started. And Gifford Pinchot, actually, with due respect, he probably was able to protect much more land through his ideals of multiple use, but the idea of sustained yield, too, that we can use these resources, but we have to use them carefully and mindfully. That was where John Muir would have agreed with him. I think the problem that John Muir had with the idea of multiple use is that it's often dominated by the extractive industries that are mostly concerned about making money and profit, not necessarily concerned about the ecological values. And I think that's where the real dilemma comes to politics today, is that we have primarily a country that thinks about resources from a very anthropocentric perspective and not from an ecological perspective. And now that we understand that humans are a part of a very complex network of nature, we have to understand that we are causing significant impacts that are very, very problematic and potentially catastrophic. To the fact that we are now looking at the Anthropocene as a geologic layer that will be able to be identified for millions and millions of years ahead because of one species, us, that has contributed to that. So the parks for John Muir was where his ideal of preservation, I think, came to fruition. So he articulated the idea that we need to preserve land, not just conserve it. And that's a big area that I think those of you who know the difference between conservation and preservation, we need to help educate our fellow citizens about this. Conservation is a very important way of managing the land, but it assumes that it is a resource for us to continue to use. This is not a bad thing. But where do we have a recognition of the intrinsic rights of nature to exist for its own sake? That is a value form that I think is much more complicated for people to understand, and it means that we have to think more about others than just ourselves. Whether it's animals or trees or whatever, and it's really why I've focused on the idea of sacred trees of Norway and Sweden in my research, because I'm a scientist. I love science, and I love teaching ecology, and I think that's the way to give people the information that we need to know about why we need to preserve some of these areas for biological diversity, for animals, for wildlife conservation, conservation biology. All of these academic areas recognize that we have to do something different than this very extractive way that we've been looking at nature. The national parks are one way of doing it, but is this really a system that we could take throughout the world? And let's look at it honestly, too. What did we do to the indigenous people when we made these national parks? And this ideal is being taken to other countries, and I think it's really problematic. Somehow we have to find a way for those people who we consider to be indigenous, who maybe have a wisdom to how you live with the land in a sustainable way, needs to be integrated into ways of looking at land management in other parts of the world, and maybe back here. And we've got the first example of this in history that John Muir, I think, would have been very supportive of, which was the Bears Ears Conservation designation. Why was that so significant as far as all the other national monuments that have been designated by a president? Any of you know why this is so uniquely significant? Yes, sir. Yes, exactly. That for the first time, the Native Americans have been asked to participate and give their perspectives on how the land should be managed. In this case, there's a lot of sacred land there with their ruins and with the petroglyphs and pictographs that are throughout that area. And you know, the other side is people are arguing that this is taking away our right to have access, which is primarily being emphasized by the off-road vehicle people. I agree that people should have access, but they have access on, Steve, what's the, you probably know more of the numbers than I do. What is I think it's 2% of the land of public lands have been designated as wilderness that prohibits off-road driving in those areas. So there's extensive areas of public lands that are still accessible. And it's not like when I've been asked about this, and I was a ranger in Utah when the Sagebrush Rebellion, is that a term you're familiar with? When I was a ranger at Canyonlands, there were still 6,000 mining claims in the park. And there was the Federal Land Management Policy Act passed in 1976, and there was a rider on it that stipulated that the 6,000 mining claims would become invalid if they did not demonstrate that they had viable ore. Well, one of the uranium miners tried to prove that he had ore without going through the proper procedures and ended up dying in an explosion by lighting the fuse and then going back to see why it didn't go off. And so there was a standoff when I was a ranger between 6,000 uranium miners and the Park Service, and they were going to send me to law enforcement training in Georgia, and I decided that's when I needed to leave the Park Service because I didn't want to go down in a blaze of glory with uranium miners. But I think the point I'm trying to make is the Sagebrush Rebellion is something that's really going on right now, and it is a debate that we need to have in this country that I personally feel that one of the most conservative, politically correct things we should be doing is taking care of our resources. If we don't, we're going to follow what has happened to civilization after civilization. When you deplete the forests, when you deplete the soils, people starve. We have catastrophic events, and war happens. We have to learn from our history and the history of civilizations that have gone before us. And I think it only makes sense that a country that is really going to be strong and sustainable has to be wise about how we use our natural resources and be very careful about that. I think we've been together long enough. I really appreciate all of you coming out, and I'll be happy to talk to you more individually. Thank you so much.